the only people that knew were Andy Willman, my boss, one other lad called Jim, but even the presenters didn't know. Basically, I kept the helmet on the entire time. On the way to and from work, I used to wear a balaclava every day, without exception. I used to park remotely. I never took my wallet into work because it had a credit card in it, all that stuff.
Welcome to the HPA Tune In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're interviewing Ben Collins. Now, you may not have heard the name Ben Collins, but if you've been watching just about any TV or movies related to cars, I'm sure you've seen him in action. Ben Collins was the famous Stig for the Top Gear series, obviously a faceless name at that point. He's also been involved with stunt driving in a number of popular movies, including the Daniel Craig 007 James Bond series, as well as stunt driving in Fast and Furious 6. So if you've seen any of those movies, chances are you've seen Ben in action. Now, this is a fairly wide-ranging interview because Ben has had a long and interesting career, including what I've just mentioned there. But one of the parts that I was really interested in was his early involvement with motorsport, where it turns out that he didn't actually get behind the wheel of a race car until he turned 18, and straight off the bat he proved to be pretty quick. And we talked to Ben today about the difference between those drivers who seem to have some natural talent behind the wheel and those who maybe have to develop that talent a little bit more through training and practice. And specifically as well with Ben's career as a race driver, we dive into some of the ins and outs of race driving, some of the more complex aspects that a lot of drivers struggle with, particularly one of those which I've struggled with myself with my amateur racing, is developing the skill set to be fast and consistent on a wet track. Ben is also involved in driver training, so we lean on that aspect of his experience today as we go through our podcast. Now, for those who haven't heard of High Performance Academy before, just a quick background. We are an online training school. We specialize in teaching all manner of performance automotive topics, namely engine building, engine tuning, wiring. We also cover race driver education, which is obviously relevant to today's topic, as well as aspects such as improving your car setup through suspension and wheel alignment, as well as optimizing your driving and your car using data analysis. Today's topic, we really are talking a lot about race driver development. So relevant to today's topic is our race driving fundamentals course, where we partnered with a local professional race driver here in New Zealand, and we developed a course that is guaranteed to improve your lap times. So if you are interested, maybe you're an amateur racer, maybe you're thinking about getting involved in a few track days, this course is guaranteed to improve your performance. Not only that, it's not just about lap times as well. By applying the lessons that you'll learn in this course, it's going to make your racing safer and more consistent, plus to top it off, you're also going to enjoy it more. So you can check that course out at hpacademy.com/courses. We will chuck a link to that course in the description for this podcast. And as a bonus, as a podcast listener, you can use the coupon code podcast75, and that will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. All right, with our brief introduction out of the way, let's jump into our interview now with Ben. All right, welcome to the podcast, Ben. Now, Ben, you're probably famous as one of the most well-known yet faceless drivers out there in the racing industry with your time as the Stig for the Top Gear series. But before we get into your time as the Stig, let's roll back the clock a little bit. I'd like to know how you first got involved in motorsport and race cars in general.
Well, first, thanks for having me on the platform, and it's great to join you. So, my passion for racing and for fast cars really, I can blame my dad for that. That was the inspiration. So, his general approach to driving and love of cars was very obvious. If you're a passenger, no two journeys were the same. Everyone was an adventure, and he had this amazing. I always get this confused with the DS, but it was the Rover SD1, the one that was wedge shaped like a Ferrari Daytona. At least that's what Rover drivers told themselves when they drove it. And it was a cool looking car. It was pretty pokey. It was rear wheel drive, and he used to shoot down the driveway and rip the handbrake and slide it sideways out onto the road, obviously safely. He looked both directions, I'm sure, before doing this maneuver.
No doubt.
And you know, he was always fully lit on overtaking moves and all this. I'm painting a bad picture of him, but there were a lot less cars on the road, and I'm not making any excuses. But he was very, very good driver, and used to make the most of it. So I grew up with that, with my mother screaming at him to slow down, and with me screaming at him to speed up. It was pretty much that way. And I had a little pedal cart, like leg powered, obviously, that I used to slide around in the, just out in the garden, basically. So for me, that was as close as I could get in my mind to Formula One. And then we had a little Lotus model. I think it was a 72 Lotus. I was born in 75. Right. And we had the JPS black car on the mantelpiece. And that was a thing of curiosity and wonder. We used to watch the Grand Prix. Used to love it. Just it was pretty cool. Actually, I wasn't a big fan of watching the races, but I was much more of a doer. Right. So I used to go nuts with the little pedal cart. I've probably talked too long about being a tiny person, but then it was there, and then we ended up moving onto a farm where there was some stuff that you could drive pretty quickly. We had a quad bike that you could flick into rear wheel drive only or 4-wheel drive. Did about 50 miles an hour. Fantastic on wet grass, and just used to take that and volley it around the farm as often as I could until it ran out of juice. So it was, and actually turned out it was quite good car control practice. So it did come into its own. But first touch of racing was not until I was 18, and that was at Silverstone. I went and tested a single seat car for the first time. It was a school car, and I did very fast times. It was as quick or quicker than that had gone. It was for the record. It was for what it's worth, a school circuit record. Okay. Before the engine blew up, and that was that. And from there, I went for it to get a race license and managed to get started.
All right, so 18 probably traditionally is quite late to get involved in your first actual on-track racing. For a lot of professional race drivers, they're sort of doing this since before they've got a driver's license. So why did it take that long to actually get out on a race track? And at that point, did you have a road car driver's license?
I had a road car. Yeah, I should do terrible things to it. But really, it was not an opportunity that was on my horizon, not even close. We moved around when I was a kid. I grew up in America. I was there till I was 10. I was competing, but I was competing at swimming, and that was, so I was training twice a day, full on. I was at a junior Olympic standard, and that was competition. And so the competition bug was definitely in there from an early age, from that side of things. But it just didn't exist on my horizon at all. I wasn't even aware that kids, could get into racing at all. And karting really is a much bigger deal. I think probably Australia, UK. It really wasn't a big deal in America. In fact, I was totally unaware of any go-karting races or anybody that did it. So it just didn't come up. And then I was back in the UK growing up. Again, it just wasn't the sort of thing I was aware of. So we didn't do it. And it was the first time I even drove a go-kart was when I was 18. It was all of it in one hit. I had to go in a go-kart, I had to go in the single-seater, and then that was a game changer.
All right.
So having been unaware of it, then there was no day I didn't wake up thinking about the same thing.
So jumping in that single-seater for the first time and going out, and obviously being quick pretty much straight off the bat. So what do you put that down to? Was it the experience drifting around a rear-wheel drive quad bike on wet grass that translated nicely to what you were doing there? How did the pieces all fit together in your mind?
I'm not sure that any of that was even in my head. That when you climb into a single seater, it's more like climbing into a fighter plane, and that's actually what my dream was as a kid, was to be a fighter pilot. So I had all the books on that. Used to read up on all these different adventures, and was fully interested in it. And actually climbing into the single seater, it looked exactly like the cockpit of a jump jet or something. It had all the small dials and controls and buttons and red switches. Don't touch those. The only difference was your backside was on the ground. I mean, It was like nothing else. It was like no real. It was totally not like a car. It really wasn't. You could see the wheels or just a bit of them, and you couldn't see much in front of you because you're sitting so low that the cockpit pretty much obscures most of your view. So it's very unusual, and it didn't really equate to anything else. And then I think just once I got going, and even just getting it in the gears, you got this tiny, almost the size of your thumb gear knob that wants to go in the wrong gears all the time unless you're very precise. So that took some getting used to. Bony controls, the pedals and everything, unbelievably responsive, which I loved. Tiny steering wheel, again, it was super responsive. One tiny movement, 1 millimeter, and the car reacted to that. So I just felt immediately at home in this world. It was very, which I had no rights to feel at home in it, but I did. And I guess it either comes naturally to you or it's something you maybe have to work towards. For me, it's both. I had an immediate affinity with what I was doing. It just came to me naturally, and then since then, you work at other parts of your trade because there's always more to learn.
All right, that's a perfect segue into talking about the natural ability versus what you have to learn. Obviously, as you've just mentioned, you clearly were lucky to be born with a fair level of natural talent and an understanding of what you needed to do in the car. How far does that get you versus what you actually then needed to practice, learn to actually master your art as a racing driver?
Well, I'm no master. So I'm learning every day. Every day I'm at school, and there's always more to do. And actually, even if you've acquired this, high level of skill, fantastic level of skill, or a superlative level, there's work to do. It's interesting. Like a lot of. I've been thinking about it recently too, because it is a bit like riding a bike. I had 7 years out of racing up until this year we're in now, and then jumped back in. Immediately felt at home and was producing, strong lap times. And then I was thinking, so is it like riding a bike, or could I've done more? For sure, with more practice, it is a constant thing. You can always improve. There's always things you could do better. You're aiming for that sort of perfect lap that does never exist, but it's trying to get as close to that as possible. So although it felt good being back in and felt competitive and all that stuff and up the front, actually, if I'm really honest, there's more I could have done. But the thing with racing is quite often you don't get the opportunity to practice more unless you get into simulators and things like that when they're really, really accurate. But certainly the physical side of it, the training side, that helps. And there's a lot of things you can do to extend yourself physically and mentally before you get in the machine. But it's funny. It's a funny thing. It's not like being a sprinter. There's physical training you can do to be a sprinter, and you can work daily on that exact thing. But racing, you tend to have a limit on how much effort you can put into practice because you're limited on time.
I mean, coming back to that, I think obviously my level of racing is nothing like yours. I'm just a weekend warrior at best, and I think even at the level I'm at, what I really enjoy about racing, it is something that you're always in search of that perfection, that perfect lap. And I guess that, as you mentioned there, you never really get to it because there is always, no matter what level you're at, my level, your level, Lewis Hamilton, Max Verstappen, there's always something that you can improve on. So that's one of the things I really love about motorsport is you're always striving for perfection that seems just a little bit out of reach. So there's always something that you can work on there.
Yeah. But you can satisfy yourself if you're just out of reach of your competition.
Yeah, that's probably enough. Yeah, finishing in front of the other person's probably good enough. Now, when we're talking about natural talent there, I mean, a lot of listeners who maybe are just getting started in their own sort of entry-level grassroots motorsport might be sort of put off by that, maybe thinking, well, I don't have that natural talent. I can't sort of sense what the car's doing. I don't have a natural understanding of where I should be braking or what speed I should be running through this corner at. Does that mean there's no hope for them? Or if you don't have that, aren't lucky enough to be born with that built-in natural talent, is it something that can be learned with practice?
I think so, yes. And I've seen that with people I've raced with. There's kind of two bookends. I mean, if you want to go to Formula One, you're going to need to have a high level of natural talent.
Yeah.
I'm afraid, because it's too competitive, and there's just too much to catch up on. But that's not to say that you can't race at a very high level if you don't work at it, and you really can hone those skills. And so some people creep up on these skills more cautiously, and the skill really is that moment when you start to feel what the tires are doing. So someone might go to a track, not actually get the car to a point where the tires are really working, and go home and then think, well, that sucked. I was way off the pace, whatever.
Yep.
But you keep moving forward. You extend your performance window. You start to get the tires working, and that's to say they start sliding around. And that's when you'll start to develop the gut feeling and start flying by the seat of your pants, because that's what it's all about. Every human being on the planet has that sense of balance, where it's just millions of years of evolution that, funnily enough, prepares you for driving, and it to a greater or lesser extent. And once you tune your senses in a little bit, acclimatize, start to feel the car shifting around you, start to pivot, feel that rotation, which end is rotating more than the other. It comes to you, but there's a lot more to it than that, and particularly when you get into things like slick tires and downforce. But for most people starting on a more simple car, I always think of Mazda MX-5s.
Yep.
Machines like that are very true, and you can get to a place where you can feel what that thing's doing fairly quickly.
Okay. So that understanding of what the tire's doing, that's sort of what the novice driver, in your opinion, should be sort of working their way towards?
Yeah, I don't think you need to dream about tyres, but that is what's happening. When you go faster, the tyres reach their limit, and that's when they start to actually work. That's when you start to use the brake pedal properly to get the car to stop. Because up until that moment, everybody on the road thinks that 35% of foot pressure on the pedal is as much as you'd ever need. I think I read a stat somewhere when I was doing some research. Most people will never push their brake pedal more than 70%, even to avoid an accident.
Yeah, right.
So things like that, you break through those barriers. You realise what is the real performance window of the tyre for braking, and that is pretty eye opening for most people. That's not the main thrust of it. Of course, you've got so much else going on, but that and looking further ahead, that the change in your vision, how you perceive what's coming up. Looking further ahead, it slows down time. You've got more time to process information. Peripheral vision too. So it's a funny thing. After some time of racing, if you go to the optician, go before and after, they'll do a peripheral vision test, and I guarantee you'll have extended it by 15% after a year's motorsport, because it just transforms how you view everything around you. But yeah, you get into that performance window, the physics starts to feel a little bit different, because you're working everything that bit more. But it's the tyre that's what's putting you through the corner. Everyone always thinks about the car, but it's always the tyre that's doing the work.
I guess no matter how much power you've got or how much money's been spent developing the car, ultimately it's the tyre contact patch that's the limit really on how fast you can go in a straight line under braking or around a corner. I think one of the problems I see with those just getting started is you've obviously predominantly most people will come from driving their road car, and the natural progression is, I want to drive a little bit faster, let's get involved in a track day or something of that grassroots motorsport. How do you go from your road driving, where obviously we don't want the car to slide unless you maybe being a little bit naughty, but we want the car to be under control and have good grip all the time, and that can make it a little bit scary when you're out on the racetrack, particularly if it's wet, and letting the car actually move around a little bit and feeling that loss of grip and not being terrified by it. Have you got any sort of advice there for us?
Yeah, well, one of the best things that happened to me was I got to do what they called high-speed car control training when I went to Silverstone. So these great cars that the skid car basically. So it's mounted on little dolly wheels, like a shopping trolley wheels on the outside of the actual tyres that can lift the front and the rear end of the car, so that it takes weight off the front or the rear set of tyres, and it simulates low grip conditions.
Yep.
And at that time, I'm not sure they'd realised that by doing slides at 65 miles an hour in one of these things was actually bad for the skid frame. So they let me do it, and it was amazing. And I mean, we did everything. So they would lift the front end, and you'd feel understeer. You'd feel the front end sliding, and I'd be turning like a demon into the corner, and the car wouldn't go in. That's understeer. And then they flicked it the other way around. They lifted the back end, so the back end was light, and turned the wheel, and the thing flicked around, and you were winding the opposite lock in and learning how to do that. Because it was simulated and there was no danger, you kind of calmly working it out with an instructor in your ear telling you what to do. All the way to, they actually lifted the whole car off the ground, and that's simulating aquaplane, when the car is lifted off by a volume of water. And that was really interesting, because as the car yawed sideways, the temptation is to hit the brakes or do something frantic with the steering, and that taught you not to do it. And then I ended up having these huge spins, sort of really like totally out of control, or so I thought. But actually, with the instructor, he was saying, look, you've got to turn your head like a ballerina. You need to look at where it is you want to go, and your arms will take you in that direction. So I learned how to catch spins. It turned out to be great training, because the first race I did, was it the first or second? It hammered down with rain, and then we went out and I was on brand new tyres, and they had no grip, and I think I spun 3 times. It was just completely pirouettes, but caught all of them. So I kept it out of the wall. And, my first year was frantic. I was spinning, going fast, crashing. It was all over the show while I learned the hard way. The skid training at the very beginning, super helpful. So whether it's on a frame or just getting hold of a V8 and doing some drifting, I think that learning that muscle memory before you go on track is a huge confidence boost.
Yeah, I think I sort of grew up with racing where I was terrified about racing in the rain, because for me, as just a weekend warrior, it was all for the fun of it. And for me, initially, the risk reward kind of skewed more towards risk when it was wet. And it's only probably been the last couple of years I've sort of embraced it and understood, well, if I want to compete in a series and be competitive, well, this is part of racing. But what I've actually found in the last couple of years as well is I learn more in a single session in the wet than probably a full season in the dry, just because you're much more likely to exceed the limits of grip, and that forces you to learn car control. Sort of, what do you think about that?
Yes, I mean, what the racing in the rain forces you to be very sensitive with the controls, and actually, depending on what car you're in, but usually, and that also depends on what the tire is like. Sliding around usually involves going off the track. You can get away with some stuff, but let's be honest, if you rock up at a corner 100 miles an hour and lock the fronts, you're in for a serious journey. It doesn't usually end well. So that first touch on the pedal is so important, and having that sensitivity under your foot to put the right amount of pressure in to get the weight transfer, to create grip in the front tires, to make them stop you. Yeah. That stuff is vital. But in the early days, you're going to scare the crap out of yourself getting that wrong, or not adjusting the brake bias enough to put it to the rear, and all those kind of elementary things. And even changing your line, because you might be making your life incredibly difficult driving on an area that's been covered in rubber from all the dry sessions. You're now driving on ice. Whereas the ones that are thinking about it have gone offline, finding better grip than you're driving on. You're driving on a much harder track. Sure. So I think it teaches finesse. It does teach finesse, and there are moments when you're driving with that finesse, and you do take a walk on the wild side and have to slither through, particularly when it's standing water. I think standing water is the one where you really are in the casino.
Yeah, that's terrifying.
Well, it's rough because you have to go for it. There's always someone who's going to, if you don't do it, someone will take that risk. You have to take the risk in the puddles, and it's a nasty sensation, because it's not as consistent as just driving on a wet track. You get used to that. You can drive the same line, but puddles make life interesting.
Let's talk a little bit about driving lines, which you just alluded to. So I think another thing that most novices without a lot of experience will tend to do on a wet track is, and understandably so, drive the same lines that they would drive in the dry. And then you look at some professionals, particularly you watch the likes of maybe Max Verstappen on a wet Formula One race, and even during the formation lap, he'll sort of be off the racing line, almost testing to see where the grip is. So can you tell us why the racing line doesn't work in the wet? And is that always the case? Should we always be avoiding the racing line, or does it develop over the course of a wet race?
Yeah, I don't believe that it is always the case that you go offline. It's not always true. It really depends on the tarmac. On a resurfaced track, it can be just as good on the normal line, and you might take some freakish line and just find yourself going slower. It's a case of really suck it and see. You made a great example with Max Verstappen. I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 years ago, but I was at the British Grand Prix watching the last complex of corners at Brooklands onto the Woodcote Straight there, and it had been dry all weekend. I think it was one of his first. It might have been his first season in F1 actually, so it might be further ago. Anyway, I think it was his first year in F1. It had not rained all weekend, and I wasn't sure if he'd even ever raced at Silverstone Grand Prix track before. So he was like for him, he was a complete rookie, and it had bucketed down with rain, so they gave them 2 warm-up laps before the race start, and it was brilliant to watch. I was with some guys who were there first Grand Prix, and I was pointed out, I said, look at this guy. He is the only one experimenting with the lines, and he went completely on the outside at Luffield, which I know that is a route round that corner. It is it's totally offline, and you basically skirt the grass. So there's a risk that if you overcook it, you've got no runoff. You go straight in the gravel, but it's much quicker. Anyway, the race got underway. He shot up about 3 or 4 places and was lapping 0.3 quicker than anybody else, and a huge chunk of it was in that corner. It was visible. He was the only one doing it. The whole grid, all the experienced ones weren't using the same line as early as he was. And so you got to try it. You got to go out there and try different stuff and see what works. Watch, and also keep an eye on what other people are doing, because they might try something freaky that works.
Yeah. I guess that's always really easy if you're following close enough to someone to be in touch with them, and you see them, trying a line that you're not driving on, and all of a sudden they're pulling away from you. Well, maybe that's an indication that some experimentation is called for. Yeah,
I mean, it's usually the slower stuff, because it's heavy braking areas. It's just a kind of a no-brainer to at least try up the inside. And you'll probably find that the braking grip is much better into a hairpin or a second or third gear corner. Almost a given, and after that, the world's your oyster. Quite often in the really quick stuff, it's not as relevant, but you never know, and you do get a feel when you move around a little bit. Just try it out.
I think it'd be interesting to sort of get a sense from you of maybe the top things that you see novice race drivers doing wrong consistently, and what can be done to improve those mistakes. If you've got a few things that you always see race drivers doing wrong.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to think now, but I mean, the hardest thing to do is braking and entering. So that's, I think, is the greatest skill. It's the hardest thing to do. Is and it's interesting. There are different techniques. I think it's a Jensen Button and some other guys. They are early brakers. That has never been my style. I can't produce a lap time braking early, and that's just not. It just doesn't work for me. If you can develop that style and make it stick, then that's amazing. I have no idea how that works, so I can't answer that one. For me, it's about braking absolutely as late as possible and being able to carry speed. So that moment, again, that sensitivity in your foot to be able to do that, commit to it, to really probe the deeper braking areas. That's something sometimes you have to force yourself to do a little bit. And again, having the ability to bleed off the brake. So probably the hardest thing to do is to brake late and not panic and be able to bleed off the brake to chuck that bit of speed in. And the way I always put it is that you should be braking so late that if you don't take your foot off the brake to an extent, the steering won't work. You won't make the corner. And maybe that's not that helpful advice. But
no,
yeah.
I think that I totally get it. It might sound a little bit strange for those who maybe haven't played around on a racetrack before, but what I see is a lot of people try and bring their road car driving techniques and apply those on the racetrack, which obviously we're trying to do two very different things. In the road car, we don't brake very hard, which you kind of alluded to earlier, and we're trying to brake in a straight line, and generally we want the car to feel smooth, whereas on the racetrack it's hard, late braking. And I think the stuff that I see from the data I look at, drivers braking too early and nowhere near as aggressively enough, not building up that initial braking as quickly as they can.
I get what you mean now. So yes, brake pressure, applying enough and applying it straight away.
Sure.
So you got to get that, again, depending on what kind of car it is. If it's a road car on the track, they don't have as much grip, but still you've got to get on that pedal because you need the weight transfer. Without the weight transfer, you just don't get as much stopping grip passed over to the front wheels. But yeah, I would say there's certainly getting enough brake pressure on. Steering position is another one. If you start messing about with any funny passing the steering wheel techniques that some of us got taught at the driving test for road driving, you can forget that. You have to have your hands in a fixed position. I guess, the simple one is just, which perhaps it's not necessarily the sexiest piece of advice, but it's just about being smooth. It's all finesse. The fastest guys really very, very smooth. Jackie Stewart was an absolute classic, and still is. But for smooth driving and getting that across, it's a real ballet. So the car can be really on the limit, but overactive steering when it's not necessary is another one that upsets the car. And I suppose another classic is for novice drivers is holding the thing too tight on the way out of the corner. So the car just wants to free up. You need to get the steering wheel straight, but they're still holding steering lock on, which actually slows the car down. Just got to let it out.
So I think there's a couple of things that you've mentioned here. You've talked about bleeding off the brakes. You've just talked about there on the corner exit, drivers trying to keep the car too tight. And what a lot of this comes down to is how the tyres work, in that they can generate a certain amount of longitudinal grip, be that in braking or acceleration. They can also generate a certain amount of maximum lateral grip for cornering. But the important thing that's really easy to overlook is they can't do both at the same time. Yeah. So if we just talk about, you've mentioned the term bleeding off the brakes. I use the term trail braking. Can you just talk to us about how that works with the weight transfer and the grip available from the tyres? Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing you've mentioned, trail braking, and people often ask me about that as well. And I think it's quite a misleading term, because to me it implies that you brake all the way into the apex. And for me, I'm trying to get the brakes off. That's just, you've left it so late that you can't just jump off them because the car won't make it. So I don't like I've really just realised that I don't like the term trail braking because I think it's misleading. Yep. So I'm trying to get off the brake as I'm steering in. So to me, that's bleeding off, not staying on. Maybe that's a semantic thing. But anyway, so you're right. So you got maximum braking grip is in a straight line. That's why you get on the pin so hard. And as soon as you start steering, you've got to share that force has to be shared between braking and steering, and that's where it gets really interesting. So you're getting off the brakes just enough to give you the grip you need at the front end, until you need all the grip on the front end. And at that point, you're off the brakes, but by the apex to get max steering to get it in there. Yep. All being well, and if the balance of the car is right, then you're soon looking back to the throttle. So as you implied, making the most of the tyre means working it to the maximum, and that's really why you max the brakes. You share some of the as you leave the brake, you're sharing that with the steering until the point where you're just using all the steering, and then you're back on the power. And for maximum acceleration, the wheel eventually is straight, give or take.
Well, that sort of leads into that other aspect you were talking about on the corner exit, drivers trying to basically hold too much steering lock. So just like the braking, bleed off of the brakes as you're turning into the corner on the corner exit in order to be able to apply the throttle, we've basically got the same thing. We need to free up the steering so we're not asking as much from the tyres laterally, correct?
Yeah, and I think it's often I think for novice drivers that are doing that, it's not knowing the track that well,
Sure.
and not knowing the points you're trying to hit. Your braking mark, you got your apex, you should be getting consistently, and then it's trusting that you're not going to just fire it off the track on the way out. So I think that's a lot of it. And some curbs are evil, some bits of grass are evil. There's some parts of the track you never want to get onto, so you're damn right to hang onto the steering wheel and don't let it out there. But once you've got a little bit of trust in yourself, that you're consistently hitting those points, then it's okay. And I think that's key, because if you don't know the track that well, then it's quite right not to use all the space until you feel a bit more confident. Otherwise, there's a chance you'll end up out there with a gob of speed you never intended to have in a part of the track you've never been to, and one bump sends you round.
Yeah, and absolutely. I don't think anyone would suggest it's a smart idea to leave the pits on your outlap and start driving 10 tenths, particularly for the novice. It's smart to build up slowly to your ultimate lap speed.
One of my favourites, this is a mean story, but he's a buddy of mine, so I can tell it. But Christian Colby, I remember when we raced in Formula 3, we were at Spa, and we went out, the track was dry, but they'd painted the curbs. And I'll never forget this, because he went out, blessed his cotton socks. It was a fourth gear corner, so we were going decent speed, and he rode up the curbs at full chat on his first lap, basically, and the paint was still wet. Round he went, bang, that was it. So to be fair, it wasn't his fault, but at the same time, maybe just one more lap would have been okay.
Would have been enough. So even on a track that well, sometimes things can change.
That had changed, exactly. Got to look out for the changes. And these days it's a lot of these so-called safety curbs that they're using. They ain't that safe. Some of them smash the car up and throw you off.
Now, another thing that you mentioned a little bit earlier was vision and looking further down the track and how that slows down time. So can you talk to us about what the average driver, maybe a novice, is doing with their vision, where they're looking versus where we should be looking, and what we can do to try and sort of keep that in the back of our mind and really focus on?
Yeah, back in the caveman days, we were out there hunting, foraging, looking further ahead, looking peripheral. Is that bear going to come out of the woods and eat me, or can I just get these berries back to my camp alive? So I think we were much more further. Our focus was more like the ninja warrior. These days we're quite near focused creatures. Laptops, books, and driving around. You kind of look at the end. A lot of people just don't even look past much the end of the bonnet. So that is out the window as soon as you get into racing. The great thing is that you apply this. It's the safest way of driving for any vehicle. It's just looking miles further ahead. You end up looking through all the windscreens of the cars in front of you. If when you're in traffic and things like that, you allow space because you realise the effects of what happens when the music stops on a motorway or highway. So looking ahead gives you more time to process what's going on, time your approach, and be ready. And so it's an essential part of racing, and it's certainly what I think is the most useful thing you end up applying in day to day.
Sure. Yeah, and I think just from my own limited experience focusing on that, one of the places where it really comes into its own is when something's happening on the track ahead of you. A classic in a meeting I just attended a few weeks back, and it was a wet track and a car spun probably 50 metres up the track. And I was in traffic, but just having that vision up ahead, I could see what was happening. And that's quite important in the wet when a car spins as well, because you're sort of making a judgment call on, is the car going off the track or is it going to come back across the front of me? And just giving you a bit more time to react to the situation rather than coming up upon it and then all of a sudden you've got no ability to get out of the way if that's what's required.
There's an interesting thing called target fixation as well, and that's a classic. So when something chaotic or dangerous happens in front of you, you tend to stare at it.
Yeah, and that's where the car goes.
Yeah, and wherever you look, your hands will follow. You will go towards it. It's one of the key things. If someone's having a crash in front of you, well, let them crack on with it, but look for the gap.
Yeah. Don't
stare at the crashing car. Stare at the empty space that you want to go to, and your body will take care of the rest.
Yes.
It's very true, and actually. And so in a smaller example, when you're in a race, particularly, and if you're in a snake and there's a group of you, it's quite easy to end up adapting your style to that car that's in front of you. If you play squash or tennis, it's kind of like the same thing. You're like, why is this person who is, useless at tennis or, this sport you're playing, why am I playing on their level? You kind of end up adjusting and sort of playing like they do. So you need to break that philosophy, and really you've got to, I think, copying the one in front at an early, like I say, when you're in the early stages of the racing, it's quite an easy trap to fall into.
Yeah.
And that as a result, the best thing to do is you arrive on the back of someone and deal with them as soon as possible. Don't get, for the numerous reasons, psychologically as well, it's the best thing to do. You just get on the attack immediately and get past them. Don't sit there and make them feel comfortable that you're behind.
Yeah, I think that target fixation is something that's super easy to overlook. It happens without people actually realizing what's going on. And I mean, I think it goes for just about anything where a bit of speed's involved. I'm involved in a bit of mountain biking and as well as snowboarding. And those are two other sports where that exact same thing happens. Something goes wrong and all of a sudden you're looking at a tree and what do you know? You hit the tree, hopefully not too hard anyway. Now, before we finish up on this topic, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the range of different cars that you've driven, which is massive. Everything from the Australian V8 Supercar series to British touring cars, Formula 3, and just about anything in between. How important is adapting your driving style to the type of car you're driving, and how do you go about doing that mentally?
Yeah, it's crucial. Obviously they're very different beasts, and going to find out what it is that they want that will make them work. For me, the biggest challenge in terms of adapting was the V8 Supercar in Australia.
Yeah,
it's hilarious. All these Euros, as you guys call anyone that's not from Australia. Sorry, that's not true. Not anyone that's not from Australia, but anyone obviously from any part near Europe. I don't know. Yeah, and the Yanks. Heading down to compete at Bathurst and being completely schooled in the process. It's a wonderful experience. I recommend it highly to everybody who's thinks they've made it. And you go down to Australia and then learn something completely different. So what's incredible is to look at. V8 Supercar looks like this sort of big muscle car. It is a big muscle car. It's got loads of power and they've got fire coming out of the exhaust and all this sort of stuff. And I thought this is going to suit me to the T. This will be just like, just going to go for it. This thing's a complete weapon. And it certainly is. But what I hadn't expected was these tiny, skinny tyres, and to spend every millisecond of my moment in the car thinking about what those things wanted me to do different. And it was incredible. And you could create instability at any moment, in any corner, at any time. It was just remarkable. So, and actually the feedback in the tyre is very, very subtle, which is a polite way of saying you can't feel what the tyres are doing. So under braking, even the pros at the front of from everybody from first place to last wears little squeaky things in their ears to tell them when the tyres have locked up under braking. It's the only series in the world that has that as a driver aid, basically. And as I found out, so that I can't remember the name of the corner now, but Bathurst has the fastest straight for any touring car race in the world. I think it's 186 mile an hour top speed. And you kind of go off the track and then turn right through this crazy fast right-hander. And then you have to stop.
Chase.
The chase. I thought it was called the chase, but I wasn't going to risk my arm. And yeah, I mean, at that speed in most cars, you've got decent downforce and stability. And so I calmly pressed the brake, or I thought fairly calmly, but there was a bump. Anyway, the car didn't like that, and it lit the front tyre up, and that was it. And it didn't just like lock up a tiny bit. It savagely locked that tyre, and there was no pulse braking technique, reducing pressure, pumping the pedal, all that crap was useless. So I was still doing probably 175, and then focus switches to there's a serious chicane here. What do I do? Fortunately, as a PlayStation artist, I knew immediately what to do, which was that I had to straight line the grassy bit and get it into the pits and apologise. So that's what I did. But it basically, and it punctured both tires. Well, it was not quite punctured. One of them was punctured, but it had gone through the canvas, so that set of tyres was just destroyed. And of course, if that happens in the race, you've just ruined the race.
Yes, absolutely.
That's an unnecessary stop. I mean, I could go on because there was a million different experiences that were just unusual, but it was an amazing challenge. So I had to adapt very quickly and figure out what was going on, apply different forces to understand what the tyre could absorb at different points in the corner. But even in the fast stuff, typically everything we just talked about, okay, slow down on the brake, get the car in, and then start to pick up the power. Even that, you could do things that were totally unconventional with the throttle, and the car would accept or deny it, depending on how the tyre was behaving in that moment. So you'd end up coming in and out of the gas through fast corners, which are very unusual, really unusual techniques. Luckily for me, I had two complete maestros as teammates. So Rick Kelly, Todd Kelly, Nathan Pretty was in my car with me, but the Kelly brothers were totally open with their data, totally amazing, right. Sharing how they drove the thing. We're having a good old laugh about the experience and what they knew and how the cars would behave. So from that perspective, it was a huge help. And I think we had pretty decent results.
Well, one of the things with that series, and I don't want to sort of laser focus too much on it because I know it's not relevant to those maybe in the Northern Hemisphere so much, but here in New Zealand and Australia, it's kind of the Bathurst, the Motorsport prize for the year. But that Supercars series, you've sort of already highlighted, quite a powerful car, under-tired, and they're pretty heavy. But a unique aspect with those cars as well is that they all run a spool, so they don't have a limited slip differential. By that, without getting too technical, both of the rear wheels are always forced to rotate at the same speed, which can cause some pretty unusual handling in terms of the car not really wanting to turn into a corner. Yeah. As a driver, anything specific you needed to do to get it drive around that spool, or is that kind of already dealt with by the setup?
There was, again, that was all constant too. You had to apply the power so slowly coming out of slow corners. It was amazing. My first test was at Winton, so coming onto the straight there, I got the car into a slight attitude coming out of the corner, which felt normal to me, but I've been used to downforce cars. So I had a little bit of yaw on the power, like a micro drift, if you will. And I thought nothing of it. And I just kept my foot going and I had it pinned. And the car was sliding ever so slightly onto the straight. And I just thought, well, I'll just change gear and that will go away. So I pulled the next gear and the car was still sliding. And I ended up tank slapping up the straight, and I just thought, when is this going to stop? And the simple answer was, it was never going to stop until I did some adjustment with the throttle. So you just had to really be so disciplined with applying the power, because once it broke traction, you were done. Right. So yeah, fire-breathing dragons, but such a really, really delicate. You had to be with the controls. It was quite incredible to get used to that. And so, yeah, that was the spool. I mean, the cars were set up to try and get around some of the resistance to turn in. So, funnily enough, you didn't really notice the suffering from understeer. Right. I didn't particularly. The great teams down there kind of dialed the cars pretty well for that. But yeah, just driving technique, slow on the power.
Yeah, okay. Now, also, just while we're talking about that, lighting up the tyres, and for a longer race, or even the sprint races these days, those tyres don't really last that well. They're only going to give optimum grip for a few laps, and it's very easy to overdrive the car, and the grip goes away. So as a driver, how are you sort of balancing that when you're out on track, particularly if you're trying to get past someone or you're defending, but you're also trying to keep your tyre life intact so that the car's going to be able to complete a stint with reasonable grip left at the end? How do you balance all of that?
Is this V8 or generally?
Well, actually, I started with V8, but I mean, the same could go for anything here. I mean, you've been involved with Le Mans prototype racing as well, Le Mans. 24-hour race, I should say. So, yeah, same goes for anything, really, I guess.
Actually, I mean, the one area I really noticed that you sort of think about tyre life outside of F1, where I think it's all they think about. But I did a little bit of NASCAR racing on the ovals, and you could force the car in a race. You could force it to do a lap time that was maybe 0.15 of a second faster than what the tyres wanted to do. You could force it to do it, but you'd do it, and you would take some energy out. That you'd immediately feel what you'd just done in the front, particularly on the front right. You get all that load on there, and start suffering. So you could keep forcing it, and actually, if you took an average of the next 10 laps, you would have been slow. You'd be now slower by probably 3-4 tenths a lap. by overdriving the tire. So that was a real nuance. Was again a discipline to think, okay, this is as quick as I can go, even if you're under pressure from someone who's behind you, or you're under pressure from yourself to catch up, to stay within the parameter of what that tire could do. I found that really interesting, and I really enjoyed it. I felt there was a lot of feedback, way more feedback in the tires in those stock cars than I imagined. I thought they'd be just like trucks with no feeling in them, whereas I felt a really strong connection. Same true of a single seat on an oval. I raced Indy Lights, and they were very sensitive with things like tire pressures and how hard you drove it on a consistent basis. But the NASCAR side, I think, because the races kind of like they were longer than what I was doing, the tire life was really critical. With things like Le Mans, we really have a good idea of what the tires are capable of. The tire manufacturers have kind of worked that out, and that you can get 3 stints out of a tire. The key thing with those is that you can really the showstopper is locking up a tire, because if you do that early on and basically skin the outer edge of the tire on one of the fronts or something like that. Well, if it's a minor lockup, it's not a big deal. You just get a bit of a vibration, and with any luck, it will kind of iron itself out. But anything more than that it's more prone to locking up again.
Sure.
And if you carry on like that, you basically risk a puncture, and that deserves severe punishment by your race engineer and teammates, because you're going to add 30 seconds to your stint that you didn't need to do if you had done a better job. So that one is the one, to produce the times, like I was saying, braking's so critical. But if you overcook it, when you've got to do 3 hours on that set of tires, you are carrying the can, and you've got to think, right, these are my best friends for 3 hours, or they're going to be my worst enemy. So you've got to try and gauge that and think about the 3 hours. But for me, it's more about the braking. If you really overdrive and the car's sliding everywhere, I think that's unlikely, because normally you've got the car well balanced for race trim. It should be set to be less aggressive than it was in qualifying. That's the idea. So that you're not kicking the tail out of every corner. If the car is not set right and it's oversteering from the get-go, they're going to have a miserable time with longevity. So I think you can make life much easier with a little bit of setup change between qualifying and race.
Yeah. Just one thing you mentioned there, I just wanted to come back and sort of dive into a bit more. You mentioned if you've had a minor lockup, that you're more likely then to have that same tyre lock up again. That's because you've sort of almost squared off a little portion of the tyre, so it's almost naturally tends to find that same flat spot there when you're braking hard the next time. Yeah,
exactly. It's just more prone. It's a weak spot basically, and as that wheel's going round, and say you're applying a constant force to it, but you're on the limit, and it will be gripping, but it's like a roulette wheel. It will find the weak spot, and it'll want to lock up on that again, and then you're in deep trouble, because then it gets hot and more angry than it was before. It's like squeezing a zit. Just gets more angry. It gets angrier and angrier the more you mess with it.
That is not an analogy I've heard before, but I can get it.
Yeah, it's like having a boil. You've just got, it's TLC. You're connected. That's it's the only interaction you've got with the track. It's through those four little rubber friends. So you've got to look after them.
All right, so let's move on a little bit. And as I said at the start, you're probably best known for being the faceless driver, the Stig, for the Top Gear series. And I'm really interested to dive into a little bit around how that came to occur. So how did you get selected for that? Did half a dozen professional race drivers sort of turn up with mirrored tints on their visors and sort of sit around with white suits on waiting to see who was fastest?
Well, the producer was too canny for that. He would never have let 6 racing drivers be in the same space at the same time, because they'd have all taken a look at each other and then blabbed if they didn't get the job. Yeah. Good point. I'd sort of I'd seen Top Gear on the TV. Top Gear has been running since the 70s, but it had a reboot in 2002, and I'd watched it and I thought that looks like a lot of fun. And I got in touch and I badgered away, tried to get in touch with different people, and eventually got through to a guy who said, "Oh, so and so is going to call you and take you down to the track." So I went to the track. I met this chap called Andy who needed a belt to keep his trousers up and looked very scruffy with big bursting folder of paperwork and stuff. And well, it turned out he was the sort of boss. I didn't know what an executive producer was, but that's the main man. And
Right.
but this was totally unbeknown to me. So he produced a stopwatch, a Ford Focus, and basically stared at me with his thumb on the button and just said, "Go." And off I went. So I went round, did some laps. He did actually show me the route around this airfield that I was supposed to take. And so yeah, I drove the wheels off it as fast as I could do it. Being a road car, the front tires got very hot very quickly, and after a few laps, I thought, well, that's it. And he just said to me, "Is that?" He said, "Is that it?" And I said, "Yeah, that's as fast as I can go." So okay, and didn't tell me whether I'd done well, awful, nothing.
Okay.
He just said, "Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, we'll be in touch." And then they weren't. There was no one in touch. So I sort of went off and thought, right, it's going to do other things. But about a month later, someone did get back to me and said, "Oh, can you come to the track again on Tuesday?" I said, yeah. So I rocked up, and there was a set of white overalls, and in between they'd filmed the death of the black Stig. So my predecessor was unceremoniously shot off the end of an aircraft carrier and crashed into the sea, never to be seen again. And I put on this new white suit and went to work, and that was the beginning of my story.
Now, how hard was it over the time you played the Stig to keep it a secret? I mean, surely your friends and family must have struggled to keep that secret.
Well, you can't trust them, can you?
No.
So ironically, I mean, at the beginning it was very easy because I just didn't tell anybody. So that's dead simple. The only people that knew were Andy Willman, my boss, one other lad called Jim, but even the presenters didn't know, and the camera team used to keep, basically I kept the helmet on the entire time. On the way to and from work, I used to wear a balaclava every day, without exception. I used to park remotely. I never took my wallet into work because it had a credit card in it, all that stuff. I just thought, let's just keep this simple. So from the get-go, that's what I did, and I followed that, and that worked perfectly. Except that as time went on, you are human, and you kind of. But I mean, even afterwards, the guys used to have a drink afterwards and stuff, and I'd sort of like just have to go home.
Ah, that's tough.
And then after a while, because you make really good friends, I'd stay. It's funny because I got a picture of it, but I would stay, but wearing the balaclava, which is strange. But obviously on an airfield, so there was no one else looking around, thinking, "Who is this terrorist?"
Yeah.
We were among friends, but yeah, got to know them. Eventually, of course, the presenters were introduced to me as well, and the net just grew slightly. So, but in the end, I think there were about 160 people at the BBC who knew who I was. And then annoying things like having to sign insurance forms and things like that I had to do in my real name. Things like hotel bookings, but I had a solution for that. I came up with a fake ID, which was Richard Jameson, I made it as a combination of the presenters' names for checking in and out of places and getting to meetings and stuff. So it only got hard at the end because towards the end there were leaks to the newspapers, stuff like that were happening, and and at the very end, unfortunately, the BBC revealed me in the TV guide, and that was kind of a showstopper. So it was at that point I realised it's the end is coming. So
sure,
it was time to plan an exit.
Yeah, okay. Let's sort of dive into what was involved with the job as the Stig. So you're setting benchmark times in some pretty impressive cars. How much time did you get in a car to actually go out and put in a really fast lap?
Not long. Everyone was always in a hurry because it was busy days. The studio days consisted of doing that business with the whichever car we had on the day. Then we'd do coaching the celeb and then get them out to their interview and other bits and pieces that would happen through the day. But also with a road car, the tires just melt. I mean, on a supercar. Sure. So like the Bugatti Veyron, good example, heavy machine. It just chewed its tires, and these tires were 50 grand a set. I think they're cheaper now, but at the time they were 50 grand. That's in, what is that? That's dollars. So Aussie dollars. What's the conversion to a US? I can't remember, but it's a lot. And on the day they came, I did 2 runs. We had to refuel it in between the runs, and after 4 laps, I would say the tires were done. The sheer force that going through them to get it to stop. And then all the aggro going through the corners with 4 tyres. With it was the Supersport, had 1,200 horsepower clawing through those tyres. So after the laps I did then, there were black lines everywhere because it had ABS. But just even with the ABS, the sheer force pushing into the tarmac on these big fat tyres was just huge. So yeah, they were done 2 sets in the space of 20 minutes.
So $100,000 worth of tyres in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Does that make you super popular with the manufacturer?
Actually, it did because it went quickest, so that was okay.
As
long as you do the job well, then I think it's all right. So in terms of time, other cars maybe a bit more time when So if you had a lighter coupe or something, you could rattle around, get a few more laps with it. And I was always very very focused on getting the absolute max out of myself and the car at the same time. So I didn't want to ever leave anything on the table. I mean, it was not like someone else was going to come in and compete with the time, but purely out of honor. I just wanted to make sure it was a true reflection.
So you're trying to do your best for the manufacturer, because this became over time quite a sort of coveted title, didn't it?
Yeah, and I took it super seriously. When that suit went on, that to me meant you have to be perfect.
Yeah.
So get absolutely everything. That's what the character is about. The Stig is about getting absolutely every ounce of speed out of that machine. So I did feel a responsibility when I put the clothes on.
Now, I did a little bit of research and digging, and I don't quite know how accurate this research was, but from what I read, you also set lap times better than Jensen Button and Nigel Mansell?
Yes.
That's got to be pretty satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, well, Mansell was a hero of mine and probably Jensen's growing up and going through racing.
Yeah.
So he was the first Formula One driver to set a time in the Suzuki Liana, the reasonably priced car. He drove the wheels off it. I mean, it was really amazing to watch. I'd never done a lap time in that car. I'd only driven it really to show the celebs around, and actually never really went that fast. I used to go fairly quick, but I didn't want to scare them. So I had no idea what the thing was capable of, but he was a good 6 seconds quicker than anybody had ever gone, off the street, if you like. It was something like that, 4, 5, 6 seconds or so.
A lifetime, basically.
Yeah. So having watched my hero set this time and then go off, producers turned around and said, "Yeah, well, you're next."
That's got to be daunting.
It was tough, and actually with Nigel, I switched cars because I thought that the tyres had melted and there was something wrong with the gearbox. So we actually had 2 cars back then, and he had a second bite at the cherry, basically. So yeah, I think it was the next week was my turn, and I had to try and beat a world champion. So it was no pressure. So just about shaded his time. And then it was a sequence of very, very skilled people going through and giving it a shot. Yeah. Damon Hill was another one. I suppose I was lucky. Lewis Hamilton came down. He looked dangerously fast, but fortunately it was a bit wet and a few corners.
Nice. So you got a free kick on that one.
I mean, I poured a couple of buckets maybe here and there. But yeah, he was really impressive. Everybody was, and it was quite funny. I saw Mark Webber down there as well, who I used to race against in Formula 3. And actually, he recognised me immediately from the way I walked, apparently. So I had to sort of convince him not to tell. But no, it was fun. It was good times.
So on the basis of something like that, even in maybe not the most relevant car, does that sort of make you sort of wonder if your opportunity was missed at the pinnacle of F1?
I would love to have done it. I would have given anything to got there. I gave it my best shot, basically. I mean, I'm glad that I've won races at every level I've competed in. Yeah. Except the one I'm in now. Actually, I'm racing this Praga, so I can't say that anymore. But I've got next year to try and fulfill that. But yeah, I would love to have made it there. I'm very lucky though to have done what I've done and gone to Le Mans in an LMP1 with a Formula One engine. We had a V10 Judd, 800 horsepower monster kicking out, huge speeds with the carbon brakes, all the downforce. In fact, more downforce than a contemporary F1 car back in the day. So yeah, I wouldn't change that for anything. Yeah, would I have liked to have raced in F1? I mean, yes, I'd love to have raced in F1. What would you give? It's a dream thing, but only the few can make it to that place. I got close, but no banana. Now I'm a very passionate spectator.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it is the pinnacle, and anyone who's grown up with a passion for motor racing's probably had dreams of standing on the podium. But as you say, there's only a handful of drivers will ever make it. So it's not within reach of most of us. Moving on, a bit of a change of pace here. Another kind of interesting aspect of your career is your professional driving services as a stunt driver, and more specifically around the James Bond movies. So, how did you get to be a stunt driver, and what's that actually entail?
Well, something you'll sympathise with, because I gather you fell off your bike. I broke some ribs, so I was qualifying in Romania in this amazing street track. It was pretty gnarly. Bumps everywhere, manhole covers. It was a really, really awesome track. It was twisty but fast. There was a fantastic rhythm to it. And I managed to get pole position. And then on the way into the pits, it past the checkered flag, a car crashed. I slowed down for the yellow flags, and the guy behind didn't. Stuffed me round into the crash car. And I went from 130 to a dead stop. And broke 4 ribs, bone in my neck. It was pretty heavy stop. So that laid me out, really. I missed, obviously, that weekend's racing, and then I wasn't fit to race in the next one. But ironically, within a week of that crash, I had a phone call to go and work on a movie. So it was National Treasure 2 was the name of the film, and the stunt coordinator got in touch, invited me to go to Pinewood Studios and look at what they were doing and have basically do a tryout. So I went out with one of the guys who was doing some driving and sat in with him. So I braced myself as he flung this thing around, and it's like my ribs were in agony. But managed to get through doing some driving, showed that I could be useful, and they hired me in. So I was on that film for about 2.5 months.
Right, okay.
So I did a mix of different driving, but mostly with me on the roof of this car. So I ended up driving what's called a pod, where the stunt driver sits on the roof, the actors are inside. Their wheel downstairs is disconnected. They've got no controls. They're all diverted up onto you on the roof to basically add the precision that they need, and so that the stunt driver can do all the rehearsals. And then basically just you put the actor straight into that situation, and they are right in the heart of the action. So they are there, and it's real, no CGI needed, and you can put the cameras wherever you want, and basically guarantee it's a safe way of getting a car chase done. So that's pretty amazing.
So hold on, let's just roll back a step. So you're driving the car from the roof.
Yes,
that sounds terrifying.
Very strange. So yeah, I mean, roofs, you put mountain bikes on it and you go camping, you stick things on there you don't care about. In the stunt world, you end up driving up there. It's pretty funky because you're up there.
The magic of Hollywood.
It's the magic of Hollywood. So it totally ruins the CFG of the car. Central gravity's all whacked.
Yeah.
And also you amplify all the sensations in the suspension are sort of doubled.
Yeah.
Because of the leverage effect on them. And so you're up and what you're used to feeling, your inner ear is sort of telling you all kinds of lies about what's happening. There's also a delay in the steering because they have to use a hydraulic steering wheel, which it's like if you've ever driven a boat, whatever you steer in, you have to steer back to get straight. You can't just let the wheel go and expect it to return. So there's a lot of handicaps in a way to how much control you have. But weirdly, you kind of get used to it. And then with a bit of rehearsal time, we were handbraking this thing around and skidding it and doing all kinds of wacky stuff. So it was an amazing learning curve.
I can only imagine a fair bit of recalibration would have been required to get sort of comfortable with driving like that.
Yeah, you basically had to stop caring quite so much. You had to sort of ignore your senses and just shut them out, become a bit of a hooligan.
Yeah, okay. So over your stunt driving career, is there any sort of standout scene that was your favourite or anything that you really enjoyed? I
mean, I've had so much fun. It was for me, blew my mind first time I doubled James Bond. Daniel Craig on Quantum of Solace was the first Bond film I worked on, and just sitting there in the car with the Amiga watch and pinstripe suit and everything, I just couldn't believe this was happening. And then there was the work. I mean, we were, if you just high speed chase around Lake Garda. It's just the best. So that whole trip was incredibly special. I think to think of sort of one thing that always seems to stand out, working on the Han Solo movie was amazing. As a massive Star Wars nerd, that also it was incredible. The machine was amazing. But actually, one of the funniest standouts is I worked on one of the Fast and Furious movies, number 6, doubling Vin Diesel. And we had the Dodge Charger Daytona. I think that's the right one. The big purple thing with a massive whale tail. We drifted this thing around Piccadilly Circus in central London. We had 2 nights to shoot it. We had sort of 3 or 4 minute lockdowns on traffic where we could do high speed sliding.
Right.
And it was really, really unruly to drive because you couldn't turn the steering wheel very much, which when you're drifting makes things quite tricky. And also when you turn the steering wheel a bit too far, the wheels will get stuck in the arches. So
Perfect.
It was quite a challenge. It wasn't manual, it was automatic. So you couldn't use the clutch and stuff like that. You just basically had to give it full send and use the throttle and the steering to try and sort of calibrate your way around.
Yeah.
And we were side by side. There was 2 of us driving, so it was me and that, and someone else doubling Letty, I think it was. And but it worked, and it was quite a tight space. There was loads of things you could crash into, and London is always busy and bustling. So the stunt team were and the producers working to control crowds and all that stuff. But there were just people all over the place. Safe. It was safely managed. Don't get me wrong, but you were aware that you didn't want to screw up. So that was really fun, and I thought it looked fantastic when it was all cut together, and just was something I think we could say we were proud of.
Now, with that sort of stunt driving, do you ideally only get one crack at this? Because obviously, particularly if you're drifting a car, there's going to be a bit of evidence left on the road after that. So do you have one crack to get it, or can you do multiple takes?
Yeah, quite often. It always, you think, if it's just film, you can always shoot it again. To some extent, there's an element of that, but nobody wants to have to do it twice because you didn't do your job properly first time. So you really want to get it right, and usually they might want to shoot it again, but that's because they're if they had a problem with the camera or they want to get a different angle, as opposed to just give you more practice. So you really want to be on your A game. And you see some of these shots, and then they are gutting because the stuff that doesn't make it, if there is a technical problem on the camera or something like that, and that one was a really good one, or because some of the stuff what you'll do is organic, especially when you've got a crowd of cars doing something. But most of the time it's very well covered, and but you never know exactly which ones you'll be repeating, so you've got to make them all count.
Sure. All right. All right, now, just to finish up, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the modern crop of supercars or hypercars now that you get to test drive and basically evaluate. And I'm interested for a start to see, you've obviously been driving these high-performance supercars and hypercars for a long period of time. What's your take on the way manufacturers are changing their design aims and what you've seen with modern technology?
The hard thing is now, everybody seems to just want to go faster. And so every year, cars have more grip, more power. And I'm not sure that that's really that much fun. It's a sort of, how do you change that? There seems to be no going back. So recent years, it's been, you've got a V8 or bigger engine, and then they add turbos. So it's just more and more powerful, but actually less and less drivable. So in the high end stuff, obviously performance is key. If you're trying to sell a supercar or a hypercar, you don't want the one that someone's like, oh no, but it's really comfortable. It's just slower than everybody else's. So that's why it's a trap.
This has become a bit of a marketing trap, really, where you've got these performance stats now that are selling these cars that in real terms are actually not maybe that relevant to the everyday enjoyment of these cars. Yeah,
basically. I mean, that said, I drove the Bugatti Chiron Super Sport. I hope that's the other day, and I just thought I'd throw that in really casually. It was a mind-bending experience, and just a real privilege to drive this thing. And that car was capable of 330 miles per hour, I think 1,600 horsepower. But and you might say, well, what's the point in that? But that's like saying, well, why bother with Concorde? It's the endeavour was worth it, because
Yeah.
the way that car handles is way better, than the first Bugatti Veyron. And I'm not putting anything down on that. That was also a fantastic piece of engineering, but this one's just better. And the styling is just, there's a few tweaks in that are improved. And I suppose in that way, the jewel in the crown is that it has this extra horsepower, and you can do these insane things from a standing start. It's just got phenomenal power all the way through. Weirdly though, really comfortable to drive, and so that one goes against what I was saying. I mean, that Chiron is so user friendly. The way they've organised the power delivery, it doesn't try and frighten you. It's actually it's very much with you. So I mean, of course, the next thing is electric and how that's going, and power delivery with that is definitely one big dollop.
Yeah, we'll talk about the EV stuff in a moment. Just coming back to the sort of the internal combustion hypercar development. Back in the day, I mean, one that's always a standout for me, although sadly I don't think I'll ever afford one, is the McLaren F1, which I think is kind of, most people would consider at or close to the pinnacle of an analog supercar. No ABS, no traction control, naturally aspirated V12 and a conventional gated manual gearbox. Whereas these days, I fear that maybe the manual gearbox is dead in the water. DCT is kind of the way it's gone, and we've got all these driver aids. So for you as a professional driver, these driver aids, do they add to the experience, or do they actually detract from it?
I think they detract from it, and it's interesting. There's another study I'd researched which was about ABS. It's a controversial one, but the study anyway, I didn't just look for this one for the sake of finding something different, but it reckoned that life was more dangerous after ABS than before it, and there was a load of reasons for this. But when you were responsible for everything the car did, and you'd have these small lockups, you'd lock a tire, and immediately that you learned something, and you immediately learn what's the limit of this car. Whereas with ABS, it's really masked, and you kind of never really aware what the car is doing for you at any time. So, I think cars were more user friendly. So there's lots of, I mean, maybe is that still the case now? It's hard to tell. But I think it basically removes the human being from the process and the enjoyment of driving. You've got things like steering wheels now that aren't physically connected. In fact, that's the majority of cars made now. So some of them are very dead, or you don't get a true feeling. And actually, an older car with a proper steering rack connected to the wheel, that's like a divining rod to the tyres. They're talking to you all the time. Whether you understand the language is a different thing, but a lot of it comes down to natural feel. Human beings got a lot more going for them than perhaps people selling software will concede. So yeah, for me, I prefer old school, and I want to feel what's going on. I prefer manual gearboxes because I can't stand automatics that don't do exactly what I tell them to do when I want it to happen.
Yep.
And movement in the car, weight transfer, same thing. We're creatures of balance. You move from side to side on your feet. You can feel torsion, grip on your feet when you walk out of the shower, when you walk down the street. It's in our nature. So weight transfer in a car is totally should be organic and built into it. And increasingly, cars are built like they're on train tracks without that feedback. And again, it's not for me.
Okay. Now, you mentioned EVs before, and I mean, I think anyone interested in cars would probably be foolish to think that EVs aren't sort of going to be the way of the future. But I mean, they come with pros and cons. Obviously, incredibly fast, and the torque delivery is quite different to an internal combustion engine. For me, and I mean, it is controversial, but I don't think they're ever going to have the sound of a conventional internal combustion engine. So we're going to lose that. But from the sheer performance perspective, what's your sort of take on the direction EVs are going, and where do you see the sort of the end game for them?
Well, I'm going to start with sound, actually, because I thought sound would be the biggest problem for me, or no, not the biggest, but a problem. And I was quite surprised. I went to a Formula E race, and immediately you can hear more, but you just hear different stuff. that's going on. I was also impressed with the fact that you could slide these things around. So actually, that sort of different sort of course, that sort of like Kraken-like sound they make, it's quite endearing. It's quite cool certainly in a performance context. So I kind of warmed to that. Where it gets interesting is, well, I mean, they're going to be part of the future. I don't believe that fossil fuels will be. It's not the end. There's a lot that needs to happen before electric is really doing what it's cracked up to do. For starters, really, there needs to be some thinking behind the energy that's powering those things. Bless them, up at the COP conference, they had some Teslas, so they had to truck in some diesel generators to charge them. So that's slightly nonsensical, and there's got to be a bit more of a path to creating the energy in a better way for the EVs to really stack up. So
sure.
Yeah, the transition, I think it needs to happen more gradually. Otherwise, there's going to be a big meltdown with shortage of making these things go. And there's a lot more that can be done in things like carbon capture on ice. I can't remember another stat, but I think gas guzzlers 25 times more efficient than they were in the 70s. That's progress.
Yeah, sure.
I'm sure there's more that can be done, and you've got things like hybrid, things like hydrogen that could come in. So the school's not out yet on what will actually work. In terms of how they handle, I think some of them have been proven to be fantastic. At the moment, obviously Teslas they were early in. Porsche, though, have come in with the Taycan, and I was talking about weight transfer. I mean, that handles like a Porsche, and you've got the feedback, and you've got weight transfer, and really smooth power delivery. There's a lot to like there, so it's going to be interesting. It's going to be an interesting. What's the word? It's not a battle, but at the moment we're at the start of the curve with these insane valuations on companies that don't make cars yet or don't make very many, and it doesn't. So if you look at that, you kind of realize, okay, let's see where this goes.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of speculation in the industry. You mentioned the stock valuations of the likes of Tesla, and we've just seen Rivian as well with their IPO, who haven't currently produced a vehicle for sale. But it's definitely an interesting time to be alive. And yeah, I don't foresee internal combustion engines being phased out in the next 5 years, but definitely it will be interesting to see where the EVs go to, and we're certainly investigating how we can be involved, because as the technology develops, we know that it's going to filter down to the enthusiast level where people want to start getting in and building project cars and repowering and tinkering. So
there's a lot of fun to be had. That's for sure. I mean, I'm desperate to get my hands on the Lotus Evija, for instance. I think it's the most powerful in the world, and I was one of the first to drive the Ford Lightning. So that was the electric powered Ford truck, and that it was pretty special. I mean, I know that truck incredibly well, and to get in the electric unit and just see the capability. So actually, we were doing a lot of demonstrations with towing capabilities and things like that. It was so easy. We're talking, you can use tiny amounts of accelerator pedal to it made towing incredibly simple. You've just got power underfoot the whole time. So there's super drivable. So there's a lot to like. But I think, at the end of the day, preference and technology will drive the change.
All right, Ben, look, I think we'll move towards wrapping things up here. I want to respect your time, and we have gone a little bit long. So there's a few questions we like to ask all of our guests, and I'll start with what you see is next up for you in the future. You mentioned you're getting back into racing at the moment, but what's sort of on your radar?
So, next up, at the moment I've got a new book out, the sort of history of Aston Martin. So I've been doing a bit of a tour with that and having some fun promoting it, and hopefully that's filling a few stockings this Christmas. But it's been it was great fun writing that. So that was a big project, 6 months of deep dive research and really learning stuff I never knew about the people behind Aston. There's some hilarious characters, and I had a great time interviewing people past and present from the company who told me some absolute crackers of some of the shenanigans that have gone on over the years, and also the engineering that went into the machines. So that's been amazing. Next thing really for me is going to be I've entered the land of YouTube. So I've got a new channel, Ben Collins Drives. We fired up on YouTube, so I'm getting stuck into that, which it's really amazing. It's refreshing. I guess it's sort of like turning back the clock. It's a bit like my first days at Top Gear. So I've been collaborating with some amazingly talented film crews, learning a lot, shooting things differently, but I suppose in a way it's doing the same thing but differently. So
Sure.
that's going to keep me busy next year, and hopefully people will enjoy what we're making.
Awesome. Now, if you were to go back in time and maybe give some advice to a younger version of yourself based on everything you've learned through your career so far, what would be your takeaways? What advice could you give to fast track the career?
Go and race for Christian Horner.
It'd be difficult to do now, I think.
Well, you say go back in time.
Sure.
So
Okay.
yeah, that's
that would
what
have done it for you.
Yeah, I mean, do you know what? I've known him for a while, and I don't know him particularly well now, but I'd say hello to. But he's always been someone who gave opportunities to young drivers, talented drivers, and to nurture that talent. He will get involved with people and stick with them and help them make the most of themselves. So yeah, he ran some amazing teams back in the day. I think he started in Formula 3, and then there's Formula 3000. And actually, there was a linch point in my career where that there was a possibility to go and do something with those guys. So yeah, that's my advice. Should have go and race for Horner in Formula 3000, and maybe things would have gone in a slightly different direction, and perhaps, but who knows? I mean, I still love what I've done. I've had an amazing career, raced in America, raced in Europe, all over the world. So perhaps you should just be grateful for what you have got.
Absolutely. There's definitely no point going through life with regrets. That's for sure. You've only got one crack at it.
I'm going to spend the night worrying.
Could have been you on that top step at Abu Dhabi F1.
I don't think
Sunday.
so. I think what we saw there was two best drivers in the world, perhaps of all time even. And when you look at the gap that those two put on the rest of the field, you've just got to realise those guys are out there. They're on another level.
Yeah, 100%.
So I take my hat off. Racing wheel to wheel with anybody in F1, you'd have your hands full. But to catch those two, you'd have to have something very, very special. So we'll see what happens next year. It's going to be an amazing return to racing.
Yeah, I think for those who maybe casually watch F1 and sort of have those thoughts that, oh, well, I could probably do that with a bit of practice. Well, the reality is that that's pretty unlikely. But yeah, when you see over the season the sort of difference in lap times between, well, where they finish, Hamilton and Verstappen versus the best of the rest, and you're still talking the best drivers in the world, you realise that they are really in a league of their own for sure.
Yeah, doing it once in qualifying, there's a skill to that, being able to summon that one lap, and some people are particularly good at it, but they're consistently, those two are doing it better than anybody else, but then they're doing it lap after lap in the race, and you'd think, not in a normal situation, there'd be someone out there who would be able to get a claw into them, for a part of a stint or something. It's just not happening. No, they're completely dominating, and because they've been pushing each other. That's what's been amazing this season, is that those two have pushed each other to another level. So it's been, it's made it exciting again, which is what race fans want.
I think it's what everyone needed, or F1 needed, and I don't think it matters which of the two you're personally backing. You can't help but take your hat off to both of them for the job they're doing. But we digress. Last question I've got for today. You've already mentioned your YouTube channel, but you've got a couple of books out as well that you haven't mentioned. You mentioned the history of Aston Martin, but you've got a couple of driving books out as well, or driving book and the Man in the White Suit. If people want to find those or follow you on other social media platforms, where are they best to go to?
Yep, so I'm getting busy on Instagram with Ben Collins Stig, at TikTok, Ben Collins Drives, and like I said, that matches the YouTube channel, Ben Collins Drives. And the books, hopefully, they should be available on Amazon or in some of the bookstores near you. The one that's titled How to Drive, which is self-explanatory, but a lot of stuff we were talking about with those performance driving skills, it's basically using, I suppose, making the most of your natural abilities, and I suppose taking things I've learned from the racetrack, from working in movies, that you can apply it to the road to make yourself a safer and better driver. But I've done it in a different way, because a lot of these, I'm not one for reading manuals. So what I did was basically explain all these skills using stories. So I picked lots of funny stories from Top Gear, from the film sets, to really bring these skills to life. So hopefully people will enjoy it. It's a good read, hopefully, and not just not a high-vis jacket.
I could definitely vouch for your How to Drive book. We've got that on the shelf, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
All right, Ben, thank you very much for your time today, and we wish you all the best with your upcoming racing.
Well, you're a star. Keep making the great content, and hopefully we'll maybe go and do some track stuff soon, produce some video.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ben.
Take care. All the best. Thanks for having me.
All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school, and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now, remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our Gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a Gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.